It's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel. Broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Welcome to Undead Live, your source for all apocalypse news. I'm Athena Actipus.
And I'm Dave Lundberg-Kenrick. And yeah, how you doing, Athena?
I'm good. Yeah, we're here today to discuss the question of, is the apocalypse over?
That's right. We're looking at both sort of the COVID apocalypse and then also all the sort of rioting. And wondering what's going to happen.
And you know what, Dave, when it comes down to it, it's really, there's a multitude of apocalypses that we're dealing with. I think, there's so many that the question of whether the apocalypse is over, maybe it's actually the wrong question, right? We have specific apocalypses that maybe are coming to a close, but many might still be raging, and we may even have new ones on the horizon.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. And I think, I think it's really worth exploring. I'm not sure I know the answer to the question across all these different things. I think the vaccine has me very optimistic. I think the election for me is a huge relief, but I think there's still a lot of question marks. So I don't know, but we got a lot of guests today to discuss it, and hopefully we'll get a lot of comments.
Yeah, let's jump right in with a question of, what has changed in the last 24 hours already in our country. And for that, we're going to bring on our correspondent, Jessica Brinkworth. Jessica,
hi.
Welcome to Undead Live.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I understand, Jessica, that you have been following very closely the executive orders that have been coming out of the White House since the Biden administration took power yesterday. Could you give us a rundown of what has happened in the last 24 hours?
So there are a ton that have been passed. I actually don't have a number on them that's I don't have an exact number because I stopped checking at 9 o'clock this morning Central Time, and they still have a slew of them planned for today. But a bunch of them apply to COVID-19 specifically because it's one of the 4 pillars of the current administration. And so there's a couple of things that have become obvious in the last 24 hours, which is the first is that there was no national plan for managing either COVID infection or the vaccine rollout. And so in light of that, these executive orders have been structured to help tamp down current infections. The very first and probably the most important thing is that the US is rejoining and staying with the WHO. So that allows us to data share and join the effort to distribute vaccines in lower income countries, which is extremely important if the aim is extermination of SARS-CoV-2. And then all federal buildings and lands will be mask mandatory. All federal workers and contractors, when engaged in work, have to be wearing masks. So that's a big change as well. There's going to be a centralized COVID-19 position that didn't exist before. So there was no person that reported directly to the president that was solely responsible for COVID-19 monitoring numbers or discussing vaccines or anything else. So that's changed now. They're reinstating the Global Health Security Biodefense Directorate. So that is probably most famous for having been used in 2014 for Ebola and Zika, and then being disassembled almost immediately when the last administration came in. So that is being reinstated. And this is a directorate whose aim is to manage on the ground early the dissemination of emerging infectious diseases. So that's really exciting. FEMA, so that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, will have to now fully reimburse COVID-related expenses to states. So before, up till yesterday, states had to more or less front all their own costs. And this has led to really uneven treatment. So those are probably the most important.
Yeah. So what do these changes mean for the future of the apocalypse?
For the future of the apocalypse, it means that now there's a top-down structure for managing the infections. And then on top of that, there's a bottom-up structure because some of the other stuff that they're requiring now, it's now federal law that every level of government down to the county level will have to report their numbers on publicly accessible dashboards. So you can't have states opting out of how many COVID infections are going on. So what this means is that we'll be able to have a more concrete federal plan that's based on the numbers of infections, how quickly they're spreading, where there are clusters. And then it also sets up a really nice structure for a centralized and more sort of intricate vaccine plan. The vaccine dissemination plans have differed state to state. It's very expensive. This leads to great inequities. And so it should help tamp down COVID in shorter order. It's not going to eliminate it, but it will help with prevention and support.
And personally, do you think the apocalypse is now over, Jessica?
No. This is a 3 to 5 year ride. If you want to have things be like they were in November 2019 for most places in the world, so there's a bunch of issues that get in the way of this, including vaccine hesitancy. But you would need, for the current vaccines that are approved in the United States, you need to be hitting just in the United States that 70% of the population would have to be vaccinated. And that would be just limiting moderate infections because that's how those vaccines are indicated.
So how long would that take to roll out? Any idea?
I mean, yeah, so this gets super complicated for several reasons. Right now, up until yesterday, the plan had been for states to organize and use things like Major League Baseball fields. And that has terrible reach because there are lots of people who can't get to those locations. There's lots of people who are disincentivized to go to large public locations. So now things may be different. We don't know what the exact plan is, but there's an executive order around outreach and reaching into communities so that it might go a little bit speedier. But the vaccines require 2 shots. So the 2 that are approved in the US market right now require 2 shots, 21 to 28 days, depending on the vaccine that you get apart. And so, and that's just to get to the efficacy that they measured at like 3 to 4 months out from being vaccinated with the second shot. So if we're just thinking in a window of 3 to 4 months, that's a pretty big haul. Like that's going to be very hard to do. And then there's the fact that responses to vaccines, like memory to vaccines, dies off. And we don't really know when this will die off, when a third booster will be required. If it's like any other coronavirus where this has been examined, at least the B cell responses will be dying off within 2 to 3 years. So it could be a really big undertaking.
So does that mean if the B cells die off, does that mean we would need to get a shot every 2 to 3 years? So what it would mean, so it depends because there's 2 types. There's multiple types of memory, and the 2 ones that we tend to focus on because they're easiest to measure are T cell memory and B cell memory. And so B cell memory, with those memory cells dying off, you lose antibodies, and antibodies are important for tagging threats for other immune cells to identify and eliminate. So, and they can opsonize, they can do things on their own to destroy things as well. So, it would be hampering a pretty important part of the immune system if that die-off happens.
Jessica, thanks so much for this update about the COVID situation and the executive orders. I'm wondering, can you give us a rundown of, are there other executive orders that have passed that you think it's important for us all to know about right now?
Yeah, so you should know that they have passed an executive order for making guidelines for reopening schools and infusing money into schools to make hardware changes around ventilation and things like that. So that didn't exist before. There was no national set of guidelines for schools. There's been an order issued to the CDC to work with states directly to update their pandemic plans. So that's important. But I think maybe the most important thing is that there's a freeze right now on any current regulations that are in the Office of Management and Budget from being approved so that they can determine what was in the pipeline. And then they're going to revert back to a system that involves like regulatory review and commentary on things that are getting passed. And so that has implications for anything that this current administration would do, and it would especially for things like COVID.
Great. Thank you, Jessica.
One more thing. I'm so sorry. He
Please.
authorized the enactment of the Defense Production Act. So this is, and this is probably most famous because it was discussed a lot in the spring around like the government can come in with the enactment of this act and overtake industrial production of any number of things, right? So they can go into Ford and say, Ford, you're really well set up for making like blown polymer sheeting. So we're going to make you do that. And this is a very different approach from what the prior administration had done, which is that they just did contracts. They're like, here, take this money, you go make this stuff. We need ventilators and, go make these things. This is the government has more oversight. And so if there continues to be PPE shortages, if there's shortages of polypropylene tips, et cetera, this act allows the government to come in and say, hey, you make polypropylene, we need you to make this. And companies do it.
Great. Jessica, thanks so much for giving us this update. I think it's time for us to bring on our UK correspondent, Neil Smith. Neil, now you're our UK apocalypse correspondent. Can you give us a more global perspective on what has been happening in the last 24 hours?
Oh, I think you might have frozen.
Yes, well, I'm honoured and slightly overwhelmed to be representing the rest of the world today, but thank you very much for having me. I think certainly in the UK there is a sense of relief at the outgoing administration, and I think certainly for us we're in our third national sort of major national lockdown. We have a new daily high yesterday of COVID-related deaths. 1,610 deaths yesterday, and in total are approaching 100,000 deaths as a nation. So we're in a tight spot, it's fair to say. And I think the outgoing administration kind of represented something of a sort of underlying existential concern for us all. So yes, I think broadly speaking, the UK and Europe is breathing a bit of a sigh of relief.
Thank you, Neil. And do you have a sort of update for us about how the news in the UK has been responding to the events of the last 24 hours?
Yes, certainly. I have a little newspaper roundup here. The Daily Mail, which is a kind of more right-leaning newspaper, let's say, and they've been quite generous to the outgoing president. Describing him as defiant to the last. So the headline there for the Mail: New Dawn for America. Dawn's gone. Let's go, Joe. The Express, which is very much the sister newspaper there, again right-leaning, and I would say, again respectful to the outgoing administration. But describes it as a big moment for US and Britain. So very much kind of inward looking, very much a newspaper, very much focused on the UK. The Guardian, certainly the Liberals' newspaper of choice, very much focused on the triumph of Biden, triumph for democracy. Democracy has prevailed. Very much enjoying the taking apart the inauguration yesterday, reveling in the way the arts were represented, the diversity, and this newspaper certainly really reveling in yesterday's inauguration. And then we have the Star here, not really much in the way of political affiliation. They've very much gone for incredible sulk there. And also worth drawing your attention here to this mention of the weather. Never let the UK never really wants to forget about the weather. But I think the Star speaks for us all with its little note here when it says, "Sleepy Joe takes over and stuns us all by being normal."
I like that one. So it's interesting. They all are sort of, even the right-wing ones are kind of enthusiastic about Biden taking over at this point. It seems like.
I think so. I think my feeling is that the outgoing president made even the most conservative European a little bit nervous. And given all we've got to contend with, I think on a personal level, we're all dealing with very serious issues. Then on a national level, our government is, well, let's be generous and say that our government is a little bit reactive and not decisive when it comes to the pandemic. And so to have this kind of international underlying existential worry of the outgoing American administration, after all, the outgoing president very much sort of, a rather volatile character, a conspiracy theorist with access to the nuclear codes. I think that would make anyone nervous.
Yeah, I think as an American, I really had this feeling of like, I don't have time for a civil war. Like I'm just exhausted from COVID, and now we gotta do this. Like, so it's really nice to be like, okay, cool. That's one less thing
I think the world is crying out for confidence, and the world is crying out for leadership. And my feeling is that, and I think for even most. The UK certainly.
Can you say that one more time?
There is
I think we lost it for a sec. Can you just repeat that last bit?
Sure. I think even for the most right-wing commentators here in the UK and in Europe, there is a sense that that the pandemic needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be dealt with in the most effective way possible. We're crying out for some confidence, and it feels like the new administration might give us all a little bit of hope.
So Neil, what do you think this means for the apocalypse? Do you think we're nearing the end of the apocalypse? Does this mark the end, or is this just one phase in a sort of ongoing set of multiple apocalypses?
Yes, my feeling is probably the latter, sort of an ongoing multiple apocalypse situation. I think, I'd like to think it's drawing one particular apocalypse to a close, so that we can all focus on solving the next apocalypse off the rank, if you like. I think I'm interested in the rhetoric involved. Just 2 weeks ago in Washington, there was the outgoing administration gave a rousing call to arms. Whereas yesterday there was a very agreeable call for love and friendship, and I prepared a Chekhov quote to make me look a little bit more intelligent than I actually am. Love, friendship, and respect do not unite people as much as a common hatred for something. But I'd like to think that's not true. It feels like a cynical quote, and I'm hoping that love, friendship, and respect will very much unite the world.
Well, that's a very inspiring way to end this little segment with you, Neil. Thank you so much for joining us today. So next up, we have a regular on Channel Z. We have our very own Dr. Z here to give us an update about the COVID apocalypse. Dr. Z, welcome to Undead Live.
Yeah, thank you, Athena, and thanks, Dave, for having me on today. I'm going to make the case that there are reasons for optimism. We've gone through a really bleak and dark time over the last bunch of months. It certainly has been difficult personally. I think most of us know somebody who's been very sick or someone who's died. It's been difficult for me professionally, as in my role as an emergency physician, where the workplace has been a tougher and bleaker place for many months. So, but I think as far as that apocalypse goes, we have some reasons for optimism. Maybe shaded by some. There's still some just distressing clouds on the horizon, but the main thing being these mRNA vaccines are a true wonder of technology. So maybe that's a techno optimism point of view. But I've been vaccinated as a first line healthcare worker, and it's starting to roll out to family members and people that I love. And this seems to be a very effective vaccine. So that's one area of huge optimism. And I think that with some of the with the new administration coming in, the likelihood that we're going to have a coordinated strategy for vaccine rollout, I see things getting way better on that score. And there's one other tiny news item that is not at all related to politics, but just science. The Eli Lilly monoclonal antibody, it's called bamlanivimab. I can't say it. It's a bamlanivimab. All right. Anyway, it's a monoclonal antibody treatment made by Eli Lilly. There was a study where they showed that in nursing homes, and once a case had been identified in a nursing home, if you gave the other residents this antibody, it protected them from getting sick with COVID-19. So this is, in addition to the vaccine, we have one more tool that might have this prophylactic benefit. This antibody doesn't seem to work very well. It's not approved for hospitalized patients or for, when I say it doesn't work very well, I'm saying for people that are already sick. It may have some incremental small benefit, but it seems to have this protective effect, and it can be rolled out in places where the vaccines are scarce. So I'm excited about that. And of course, we talked, Jessica brought up this idea about the Defense Authorization Act and rolling out personal protective equipment and satisfying some of those shortages. I'll tell you, even in my workplace, I was still using a N95 respirator mask for, this one that I've used for many weeks. It's been in the oven to disinfect it. Anyway, we've coped with shortages by doing some semi-crazy things we never would have done before, and I look to see those days going away. So I'm happy about that. Of course, we still have some huge problems, right? Once we're done with the pandemic, we have to turn our attention to health access, opioid epidemics, climate change. These are big, huge cooperation and coordination problems that will require a government solution. So I'm sort of optimistic that we're going to make progress on those scores as well.
Zed, we have a question from Liz. She's asking, what would you say to people who are anxious about taking the vaccine?
Well, as my wife, and she's a primary care physician, as she tells her patients, you have two choices, vaccine or COVID. And the safety profile of the vaccine is really good. And granted, it's new, but now it's been used on millions of people. And we know the effects of COVID are quite dire, and the effects of having COVID and spreading it to other people that you love. It's far better to get the vaccine. I'm you can tell that I'm a proponent of the vaccine, and I think that the anxiety, while it's understandable, it's misplaced.
So can I ask a question about the vaccine and one question about vaccine and one about masks? So does the vaccine, if we get the vaccine, can we still spread it? Like, does that can we go back to normal life? What's it, what are the sort of, what are the precautions we should take? And
well, that's a good question. And so the question is, does it mean that we can just throw our masks away and frolic and go back to a complete life as normal? And I think that we can go to a more normal or normal-ish state of affairs once we've been vaccinated. But we don't have data on whether the vaccine might still allow one to get kind of subclinically infected with COVID and potentially spread it to somebody else. And I think until we have those data, we should be careful. So it's the precautionary principle. So I went to the grocery store yesterday. I wore a mask. And of course, it's the law here in New Mexico. And it sounds like those kinds of mask wearing, legal, they may be more common, especially in federal workplaces. But anyway, it's a good thing to do. So I want
to bring Jessica in as well. So Jessica, as an immunologist, what are your thoughts about the vaccine and mask wearing, and how should we be sort of dealing with these changes now in the kinds of precautions that we need to be taking or not as the vaccine rolls out?
Right. So as I mentioned before, we don't know when B cell responses will die off. And so it's not a one-all solution. I have a slightly more negative viewpoint than Dr. Zed, in no small part because of so I used to be a biologics drug policy analyst for Health Canada, and vaccines are biologic drugs. These are amazing vaccines. They're just the coolest the coolest technology, and they're designed to like both stimulate an immune response and to avoid being eaten up by immune cells. So it's kind of really cool, but they are currently indicated in a really narrow way for limiting. So the two things that are on the American market, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, are indicated for limiting moderate symptoms. They're not indicated, as in they're not approved, because there's no data to demonstrate this specifically, that they prevent infection. The way that the trial was for both of those vaccines was structured, the outcome was supposed to be limits moderate symptoms. So we don't have enough data. It will be maybe 2 years before we get enough data on those vaccines to know how effective they are at limiting infections, period. So it's a long haul.
So Jessica, are you saying that basically the vaccine, what we know is that if you get COVID after being vaccinated, you're much less likely to have severe symptoms, but you can still get COVID?
Yeah, you can still get COVID. That's true for a lot of vaccines that are on the market anyway. You can still get infected. It limits symptoms. So, but again, this is one of these things where it comes down to, so there's what's scientifically real, and then there's what can be supported for the issuance of a drug on the market so that it's safe and effective and is of high quality. And so when Pfizer and Moderna set the goalposts as limits moderate symptoms, they were doing that at a time when, we didn't know how many asymptomatic people there were. The goal wasn't to wasn't necessarily to eliminate infection. It was like, what's the most reasonable goal we can demonstrate? What can we demonstrate? Okay, if we get somebody who's COVID positive and they don't progress to like severity and they're within a certain age range, et cetera, we can then say, okay, given who had the placebo and who had the vaccine, that the vaccine was effective for that. That's really what it's sort of a technical thing. So it could be that it is totally effective, but
it's effective for the things that we care most about, right? I mean, for every other vaccine, we care about the clinical presentation of the disease more than asymptomatic carriage of the disease. So you're right, we don't have data on that, but we want to prevent people from getting sick and going to the hospital and dying. And the vaccines are so far effective at that. It's not 100%. It's about 96% effectiveness at reducing the likelihood that you're going to get COVID, but it still is pretty darn good. And I agree. There's other populations we need to test. We haven't talked about kids and the rollout for children.
Yeah,
it's going to be a whole nother
it's
issue.
age limited, that's typical for vaccines anyway. And then the other thing is they're not like a lot of other vaccines. There's no human challenge data, so no one has been specifically infected with SARS-CoV-2. They're relying on natural infections to happen. This is the most ethical thing to do because there's no recovery drug, right? There's nothing that can like stop that infection once it starts. So,
luckily, there are plenty of natural infections to go around.
So they rely on the natural infections to happen. And what this means is that you actually need a lot more data. You need data on a lot more people to hit statistical significance. So they are effective, but we don't know all of the things they're effective for.
So we have a lightning round here of questions from the audience. The first one here is from Liz. She's asking, does this mean you should get the vaccine, but still be careful about possibly infecting others who haven't yet gotten the vaccine? Joe, do you want to take that one?
I think that's true. That's an ethical imperative for someone like me, where I'm being exposed to the virus every day. I was yesterday at work. And even though I'm vaccinated, I could potentially, we just don't know, have a subclinical infection and pass it to somebody else. So of course, being careful. Yeah, and still I don't want to there still is a possibility I can get infected, and I'd rather not purposefully, expose myself to someone who's sick. So there's that too.
Great. Next question. This one is for you, Jessica. Do you think people should actually keep wearing masks and social distance even after they get the vaccine to keep a unified front and not to confuse the message about mask wearing?
I think that they should be wearing masks and socially distancing because it's biologically necessary. Like it's not so much about confusing the message on masking, and that's important too. It's more that we don't like it's the combination of these three things that's going to limit infections. Even if you did get 70% of the US population, vaccinated, we still have hard to reach populations. And then on top of that, we still have we don't have data on the most important things about the efficacy of this vaccine in the long run. So, or on anything other than moderate severity. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We have another question here from Carlo Maley. Can we use COVID testing to see if vaccinated people are protected from the infection? Joe, do you want to take that one?
So I don't think that we're doing that routinely. The scientific evidence suggests that the antibody response to the vaccine is better and greater than even natural infection. I'm sure that in a research setting, we'll be monitoring this to see how long those antibody responses last. And whether, of course, they also work for these variant, the new mutant strains that have emerged in the UK and South Africa and also in Brazil. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty still.
Yes, Carl actually has a related question here about the new variants. So, Jessica, what do you think these new variants mean for the future of the COVID apocalypse?
So there's a couple of things. I don't know that any of them actually evade the vaccine. So far, Pfizer and Moderna have said that they don't think that that's the case because the target, the mRNA target, the DNA, the protein that they're targeting, the section of the spike protein that they're targeting doesn't seem to be affected. But the second thing is, oh no, I just sort of dropped it in my head. Okay, so the brilliance of these vaccines is that you can just pop RNA in and out of them. You can say, okay, we see that this section of the spike protein on this virus is changing really quickly, so now we're going to target something else. And so that's one of the powers of this type of vaccine technology. And then I dropped the second part of his question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, we can go. We have one more question from Carlo. We've had a number of them. When will we know about the vaccine results for children, and just in general, what do we know about sort of what life will be like for kids moving forward now with the sort of changes in having more vaccine rollout? How are children's lives going to be changed, including but not limited to the vaccine for them? Yeah, Jessica, do you want to take that one?
So right now, Moderna reported this past week that they're having trouble recruiting the 3,000 people they need to recruit for subadult vaccinations. So it might be a little bit of time, but the important thing is that this is an indication that can be added on to the original approval. And so the burden, like the data burden isn't as high because they've already demonstrated that they have a safe drug and a high quality drug. They're just looking now to see that it's safe in this population and that it's effective. So the data burden is not as high. It shouldn't take as long.
That's great. So one final question here for this segment from Pam. She's asking, will we ever return to normal? Jessica, what are your thoughts? Will we return to normal?
I think if you want to return to where we were in November 2019, you're going to have to subsidize and get used to the notion of going into lower income countries and aggressively reaching out and trying to administer vaccines in the most appropriate and sensitive way. That's the only way to really do it. And I think the other thing is that we need to maybe adjust to the notion that this isn't a vaccine strategy that's necessarily even going to achieve extermination, that this is a vaccine strategy that's going to tamp numbers down.
So why would aggressively pursuing it in other countries, why is that a necessary step?
You wouldn't want pockets, right? If you want to return back to traveling on airplanes and things like that, just selfishly speaking, if you want to return to traveling on airplanes frequently, you want to make sure that you have, you don't have whole countries that are just overrun with this particular infection. But on the other, and I think probably the more important perspective, you want to, it's the right thing to, it's the human thing to do, right?
That makes sense. I guess I'm just also, it's sort of going back to this question of, wait, once I get vaccinated, I can't just go back to
No.
Doing whatever I want.
Right now, we don't have data to support that that's the case. We have data to support that you won't get moderate symptoms.
Okay.
What do you think, Dr. Zed? Will we ever go back to normal?
No, I think that this is a step change, both from a political perspective, which is where we started off this conversation. I think that the outgoing administration and recent events have revealed a major societal rift that are going to require a lot of work. We have our work cut out for us. But just from the pandemic, this apocalypse that we're going through right now, I think we've talked about it at work how we're never going to go back to a time where we would just routinely go into a coughing patient's room without a mask. So it's going to change how we take care of patients, just like we wear gloves all the time and do universal precautions around people where we might be exposed to body fluids. That was not always the case. So this is really going to change how we take care of people. I think doing telemedicine, the fact that we do Zoom meetings and online events as opposed to in-person travel, that's going to have a beneficial impact on the environment and on carbon emissions and that sort of thing. I think that things are never going to go back to the way they were before, and in some ways, that's good.
And so, from your perspective, Dr. Zed, are we nearing the close of this particular apocalypse, or is this apocalypse just going to sort of go on in a different form for a while?
I am hopeful. I think Jessica earlier talked about the goal of driving this virus into extinction. That may not be in the cards, but I think that we will be able to control it in the way that we control other plagues like HIV. And make it so that it is no longer a problem for us as much as it is right now.
Yeah. Liz is pointing out here that, maybe there's also a positive side to, having this moment of crisis, but helping us to realize that perhaps the way that we're caring for others needs to improve, but we need to sort of up our game in terms of that.
That's a great point.
It's definitely highlighted terrible inequities that, people who study social determinants of health have known about for eons, but I think for the average person, it's highlighting like a real need to cooperate. I just want to say, in response to Carla, I remember what I was going to say. It's not the vaccines, it's the test. So the UK variant 117 suffers from a thing called, well, it doesn't suffer, we suffer from this phenomenon known as spike dropout. So the primers in the PCR test, the little bits of DNA that have to lie down on the available RNA from that virus, they don't lay down on that variant. So you can get a false negative as a test. So you get no amplification and a false negative. And so that's a really big problem for testing. But that's also easily fixed by just changing your target or having two targets. So I think that's a change that we'll see with that.
Okay, we have one final question here. This one from Carla, which I think is on a lot of our minds, if just subconsciously, because returning to normal for, I think, at least for me, part of that is being able to be around strangers without having a mask on. Do you think we will be able to return to being in public without masks, flying without masks, going to concerts without masks? Is that something that will be something that we can do without taking a risk at some point in the future?
I'll say again, optimistically, I hope so. And I think that probably by the end of summer, we should be able to go back to at least being outside without masks routinely. I think I do see that coming once we achieve a certain degree of herd immunity, both with vaccination and with natural infection.
I don't. So this is a virus that doesn't mutate that often compared to, say, influenza. And so one of the things, if you want to compare it to like the 1918 flu, is one of the things that contributes to the extermination of something is not just all these other protective measures. It's the fact that it's mutated, that particular virus and influenzas generally mutate so quickly that, they move on to the next most beneficial thing for them. And so because this doesn't change that fast, I don't foresee. And I think that there's always going to be people, minimally, the most optimistic point of view I have is that there will always be people that will always have to be masked. Anybody with comorbidities will always have to be masked. And I think that certain segments of the population outside of that will always have to be masks. Yeah. So I don't see it ending, but I could maybe a year from now adopt a more optimistic point of view.
Mm-hmm. So Jessica, are you saying that
airline flights and that sort of thing, I think that's another step change where when we're on planes, I think that there's going to be routine masking for a long time.
Yeah. So, and Jessica, you're saying that for some people in the population, wearing a mask in public is always going to be a good idea, but for others, it may be okay to not be masking. Is that right?
I would be willing to permit that that's a possibility in the distant future. I don't think this is something that's coming in a year. I think this is something that's coming at minimum 2 years out from now, and maybe longer. So I think that it's going to continue. And that doesn't mean that regulatory bodies won't drop it. I just think that the safest thing to do will probably be to stay that way. But the other thing that has to change, though, right? We have so public transportation is a really good point. Like we may always have to be masked on public transportation, but there's just other things that we don't think about that much. Like ventilation in buildings is going to have to alter, right? What kind of confined spaces we allow people to work in, how our bathroom doors are structured. There's a lot of stuff that's going to have to be more widely adopted, and that's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of time.
But perhaps there'll be a positive side of this, right? I mean, we've known for a while now that a lot of indoor workspaces are actually pretty unhealthy in terms of airflow and air quality. So maybe it'll be an opportunity for positive change in that respect.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, from my perspective, all of the coming changes are positive, in no small part because they'll eliminate a lot of other infections too. And then on top of that, having more open spaces that are better ventilated is just better. It won't be, living in a cube farm is not necessarily going to be the most, I guess that it's not going to be the way that we work necessarily in the future.
Yeah, some people at work just during my last shift were talking about how amazing it was that they didn't get a cold during the last year. But of course, that's because of everything else. And I think that the incidence of the common cold, just like the incidence of flu, is way, way down. We've almost annihilated the flu with some of these non-pharmacological measures that we're doing for coronavirus. Just that coronavirus is such a transmissible and difficult virus to control that it's still a problem for us and requires the vaccine also. But yeah, I look forward to a day when we can get rid of the common cold too. So that's another area of optimism. And maybe we can find some mRNA virus that's effective against that, because I hate getting colds.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zed. And thank you, Jessica, for joining us for this segment. And now we have the pleasure of welcoming to the next segment, Carl Flink, who is the host of our newest show on Channel Z, or actually our second newest show.
Right. So, although he's also on our newest show.
He is.
But hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm disappointed we let Jessica go, because I have to say I wanted a tour of her zombie response armory that she had behind her.
It's still right there.
It seems to me like there's some explanation of all the equipment, the scissors, the what look like meat hooks, and other implements. I think there needs to be some talk about that.
What is that?
I think so. Actually, Jessica is going to get the zombies by having them do yoga with her.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely going to have them peace out. That's a wallpaper removing device. So I moved into a house that had 40-year-old wallpaper, and it was vinyl, and so we had to puncture it. And so you roll it, it punctures everything. It looks like a mace. It could be a good zombie weapon. And then the hooks. That's just from my New York apartment. We just haven't gotten rid of it. So, and everything else is just home construction and crafting stuff.
It's great to know that that's your wallpaper removal equipment.
I'm not mashing up zombies and hanging them off the hooks on my
good cover in today's world of unity and peace that we're now in, apparently.
Thanks, Jessica.
So I was thinking as I was listening to everything. I'm not a scientist or a doctor. I'm an artist who regularly works with scientists and doctors, which might be why I'm qualified to be on today's discussion. Or maybe it's also that artists offer unique perspectives on how to respond to apocalypses that can differ from respected scientists, doctors, and policymakers. I'm really moved by Dr. Zed's optimism. And I think it's really important for the listeners and us to all think about how do we emerge from apocalypses like the pandemic, because as a dance maker, a choreographer, it's terrifying for me to keep hearing that we're going to keep masks on, we're going to keep social distancing. That actually goes directly to how I live my life and might utterly change what I do. It doesn't mean I can't be responsive and ethical and thoughtful about how we go, keep moving through this, but how do we actually move towards touch and contact again, and how important that is to us as human beings. We come from a physical being for the most part, from a woman's womb. Touch is kind of part of what we're made from. And so I hope as we keep talking about this and as policymakers are thinking about this, how do we view what is the end game we're getting to? I don't care whether it's getting back to normal, because I don't even know what that really is. But I do think this eye on the prize of how we get back to physical contact and togetherness is super important.
And Carl, what are your thoughts or feelings after the change that we've had in the last 24 hours in the way that our country is going to move forward? The sort of message of unity and hope that we had from Joe Biden yesterday. Where do you stand as an artist, as a performer, as a human, when you're sort of reflecting on these changes?
From an emotional standpoint or a spiritual standpoint, just hearing those thoughts of unity and togetherness were deeply uplifting, especially in the last 4 years of hyper-American narcissism that we've experienced. This kind of focus on the short term and on one individual who needs an immense amount of attention. This idea of kind of expanding focus and being responsive to multiple potential apocalypses or challenges that we're facing, even though that's daunting, it was an incredibly hopeful message. And I was really uplifted, not only about the passion for having an organized and thoughtful national plan for moving forward with the pandemic, but I'm really impressed with the rhetoric and languaging that the new president's administration is bringing in terms of racial equity, the 402-year pandemic that our country has experienced, starting with enslaved persons and the racist histories of so much of our social systems. To hear that language coming into a national discourse, that feels like an antidote being put forward to address these other larger epidemics. And I, as an artist, can really grab a hold of that, because those are places where I can wrestle with what are our identities? How do we respond to not only the pandemic and the medical issues, but also the social issues?
Carl, we have some comments here from Alana about the challenges for artists that, especially for sort of smaller scale artists, not the sort of, big Hollywood production crews with huge budgets, that it's very hard to create non-remote art right now. So for you as a performer, do you feel like this apocalypse is coming to a close, or do you think it's going to be sort of continuing indefinitely at this point?
Well, there's no doubt that the pandemic has had a tectonic impact on the artistic field, especially live performance. I do think that the optimistic person inside of me knows that artists, performing artists, visual artists are inherently innovators and entrepreneurs in how they approach things. But I do know that there's a high level of exhaustion starting to come into place with like remote classes or remote performances, and this hunger for live performance again. And so Governor Cuomo of New York just recently issued some really powerful thoughts about how the state of New York needs to support artists as a critical part of their social framework. And I think one of the things we can all admit is that artists have been a critical part of surviving the pandemic, everybody has been consuming immense amounts of TV, literature, videos, and performances. And that's been one of the ways we've survived this and actually had a chance to reflect and introspect. So I think that there's still going to be quite a while for these art forms to kind of rebound, but I'm very confident that as a group of people, they're highly innovative in responding.
Great. Thank you, Carl. I'm going to bring in Liz Grumbach as well now. So Liz is one of the hosts of Brain Dead Theater and has a really unique perspective on all of these matters. So Liz, would you share with us what do you think about the apocalyptic moment? Is it over? Is it continuing? What does the future hold in your opinion?
You're muted.
She's not muted, but we're having trouble hearing you.
Yeah.
So,
Liz.
She's been zapped.
All right.
Well,
could you pantomime? I feel like
yeah.
this
Well,
would be
so
a good time to
interpretive dance moment, Liz. You and I will.
So yeah, how do you feel? How do you feel about the future of art?
For Liz, art's been very important. So she's commented here. Stories and narratives have been really important for her in these past months, and they have made a big difference, I think, for not just for her, but I think for a lot of us. I mean, I know I've been, enjoying both reading books and, I probably watch more TV than I ever have in my life, with my kids and with my husband, and movies too. And so
and I
given
think I'm back.
You're back.
Okay.
Liz.
All
Great.
Right. The zombies took over all of my audio equipment, and I don't know. I think that's just the lingering power of the outgoing administration, maybe that apocalypse. But thank you. No, that's exactly right, Athena. I've been consuming so much, and I think that one of the things I realized yesterday is that all of this talk of unity and togetherness is really powerful, but what is super powerful are these moments of joy that I think a lot of us experienced. And some of my moments of joy yesterday was hearing Amanda Gorman read that beautiful poem, her beautiful art, right? And also, I don't know if anyone else was on the internet as much as me. I think a lot of us were, but the memes of Bernie Sanders, the mittens memes, right? Like those kind of moments, that kind of joyful unity. And a lot of us have been on TikTok. Inauguration Day TikTok was just like on fire yesterday. And I think that kind of, to sustain ourselves in this moment, we've looked to art. We've looked to, art that was born out of the apocalypse, but also those kind of nostalgic things that are reminding us of how important relationships with others and ourselves and our pasts are.
Yeah, Liz, I love how you brought up, the memes and TikTok, because I think, for a lot of us, the role of social media has been pretty negative in terms of the way that it has, influenced things. So how do you kind of grapple with this, these multiple roles that social media can and does play in terms of the sort of, direction of our country, and also just the, personal enjoyment and connection that is possible through it?
I think it's so important. Facebook and Twitter have become this. Sorry, I have to address Erica. You're super right. That's my favorite part of the Bernie memes. But no, I think Facebook and Twitter have become these holes that you can get lost in because you can't see your community there. But once you find your community there, once you find the community of people creating things, the community of people surviving together, right? That's where the power of social media platforms are. Now, there's also a danger there because there are other kinds of communities that are forming that are geared towards violence, right? But But I think, you know, hopefully we're at a turning point where we understand the power that these platforms have for both good and evil, and we can be more educated about finding where the kind of survival networks are online.
Thank you, Liz. That makes a lot of sense. Carl, for you, does social media play a role in your life as a, you know, as a human being or as a professional?
Yeah, I don't think it's lost any importance. Actually, it's become more important during this time for artists to amplify their work and their voices. I think the big challenge that social media often presents to the performing arts, maybe a little less with music, is its lack of three-dimensionality. So you're always trying to, you know, fiddle with how do you bring that liveness, even if it's a live stream, that three-dimensional depth into things. But I mean, going back to some of the things what Liz was saying, is I think that what artists really are in a position to help us do is not only tell stories and narratives, but also help us process, because the artistic lens isn't simply driven by words. It can be, but it's driven by physicality. It's driven by the singing voice. And so it allows us to experience all of these changes in a multifaceted way. And I think that social media is one of those facets that move and relate. And I think artists are particularly well positioned to do that synthesizing.
Yeah. And this, you know, this potential role for social media as like a way to help process what's going on. Liz, is that something that you experience in your life, or you see other people sort of using social media in that way?
I definitely think that's true. I mean, I keep going back to TikTok because I think TikTok has been like the platform of the pandemic, right? Where we see a lot of people kind of creating to express what they're going through, or at least that's what my TikTok feed is, right? Like what's great about TikTok is that your feed is like very specific. So like my feed is a lot of people dealing with the, you know, mental health issues because of the pandemic. My feed is a lot of LGBTQ plus people, right? Trying to sort out where their lives are headed under this like restrictive administration that's now a new administration, right? And so I think that there's a power there, as long as you're on the right parts of the internet. I don't know.
It's so interesting because, I mean, I think we've talked about this off and on during this conversation about how unity can be its own problem. I think Liz is alluding to this idea that, you know, artists can also be forces for negative imagery and violence. I mean, one of the most important filmmakers, or that some people consider an important filmmaker, was Leni Riefenstahl, who was the Nazi propaganda filmmaker. And so we have to be aware that artists can also, you know, be a part of the problem here. And so it's this constant dialogue. And I think that social media is a critical place for voices that have been silenced, voices that have been peripheralized. Some of those voices are also voices that tend towards violence as well. And so it's just this constant idea of trying to find what is the right balance to bring forward constructive dialogue.
And you know, we've been sort of dealing with a bit of a crisis with social media recently. And where do you both stand on this issue of deplatforming? Do you think that it's a good thing to sort of remove people from these platforms that are potentially encouraging violence, or really having a negative effect on our ability to sort of come together as a society? Or do we need to allow people to just do whatever they want and say whatever they want on these platforms?
I would love to hear Carl's perspective, but I war with myself a lot about this, right? Because I do believe in the freedom to express yourself, but I have a firm belief that if you're causing the apocalypse, then you don't deserve a platform. Yeah. And I think that's where I draw. That's my line. It's actually not, I think, a very it's not it's a hard line, right? But I don't think it's an unpopular line. I think if you're think that's where I am.
I mean, in some ways, this is where I get to bring my strange background as a one-time practicing attorney. So I'm really fascinated with this question, not only as an artist, but also as a social justice attorney who practiced for 4 years of my life. I think that this is actually not as complicated a question as you would think, because inciting riot, walking into a movie theater and shouting fire, that isn't protected speech. And so the big challenge is placing the line. What is the bar for when something crosses into those places of incitement? And so if someone is using a platform clearly to incite violence, or as Liz says, an apocalypse, that's actually not that difficult a question. They should be removed until they can show that they're going to use that platform for appropriate speech. And so I think I would. The bigger challenge is where the line gets drawn, right? And that's where having a pluralistic society is important, so that we're arguing and finding it as a group of multiple perspectives, where we think an appropriate realm of public speech is.
So Erica is pointing out sort of an interesting meta thing that's going on right now. Apparently under our YouTube stream, there's a bot that has helped to sort of tag this to make sure that that people are getting the right information, that Joe Biden is the president of the United States, and they can click through for more information. So, these social media platforms, right, now there's some mechanisms for kind of, making sure that people are at least having access to information. And it's, it's interesting. We're in it right now ourselves, during this stream. So
we're having a bot performance. Have we contended that Joe Biden wasn't the president yet, or just trying to reaffirm what we've been talking about? That's really
no, we talk about this. The bots that are sort of monitoring. I think they're looking for keywords and topics, and then it's a automated system that.
Proactive, just in case.
Just in case.
Which is, I don't know, which is kind of nice. And I have to say, so one of the things that I love about that new kind of combating misinformation, what Erica says right here, right, is that it's an evolution of what was happening on Tumblr and then TikTok for a really long time, which was these kind of warnings that there might be mentions of suicide, there might be mentions of self-harm, right, to take care of yourself. And that kind of evolved into a kind of like take care of society mechanism, right? And it's not always right, it's not always good, but I think we're getting closer to something good.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to think about the social media piece. Is one of the things we've seen is so much more of our society dancing. There are TikTok, all of these things. There are people who, all of my daughter's soccer teammates doing dance videos when they have never taken a dance class in their life, and suddenly they're doing these gestures and things. I think that's a really exciting evolution, that social media has created permissions for people to try things that they wouldn't normally have, dipped their toes into.
Yeah. So Liz, any last thoughts? Are we in the apocalypse? Is the apocalypse going to continue? Is it coming to a close? Do we just have a multitude of apocalypses all going on in various stages?
I think I liked what Jessica said, that, the apocalypse will continue probably for a couple of years or forever. But I will say I am, I don't know if anyone watching or y'all noticed, but I am out from under my stairs. So I feel like I'm closer to the end, right? I'm closer to something more normal.
I love the ambiguity. You're closer to the end and you're closer to something more normal. So... And I think we're actually at the end now of our episode. So thank you so much, Liz. And thank you, Carl, for joining us. And Dave, what are your thoughts after all this? Do you think the apocalypse is over?
I think I might have to answer that question in another episode. So I think we can discuss that another day. Whether or not I feel comfortable. I'm not as optimistic as some people, knowing that all of our sort of speech mechanisms are controlled by essentially like a half dozen tech billionaires, but we can discuss that another day. So, and the bots that they have programmed to sort of blindly censor us. I don't know. But I'm really excited about the vaccine stuff. So
Yeah.
I think that's a good note to end it on.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. And remember, whether you are dead, undead, or entirely alive, Undead Live is the source for all of your news. So thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.